Hello, my name is Hieu. I'm a PhD student in the electrical engineering, and my advisor is Dr. Tao. Today, I'm going to present our current research, which is the autoencoder-based lossy compression for large-scale scientific data. Our goals are to definitely reduce the size of the data, because for the data that we are working on is a very huge data for the climate simulation domain. The whole data set is like around several terabytes to petabytes. Another goal that we want to have is to build an end-to-end compression model, which means that the user can easily use our model to compress the data and decompress the data in just like one line of code. Because we are building a lossy compression model, there will be some loss of information in the reconstructed data. So we don't want to lose too much information of the original data in the reconstructed data. And furthermore, we want to have a model that can be run on a normal computer, just like my regular desktop at home, which has only like the regular GPU and CPU. And the data that we are working on right now in the early stage of our research is a subset of the whole domain. And this subset of data is the simulated monthly ocean surface temperature from the 2nd century to the 6th century. And the size of this data is around 200 gigabytes. And the data is in a netcdf format. And the output, like my pipeline will handle everything, put everything together. And if you want the reconstructed data, that reconstructed data will be in the netcdf format. You don't have to do any further coding to get the reconstructed data. Now let's talk about the methodology of our research. In this part, I split it into two parts: the training and the compression. In the training phase, it is quite hard to use the raw data because this raw data is huge. And this raw data is a time series data, with each time slice being a 2D data, or like it's similar to a 2D image. And each timeline is very similar to a 4K image. That's why we need to do some data preprocessing to be able to train the model. For the training step, we are using an overlapping data partition method. Basically, we partition the raw data into much smaller blocks of size like 64 by 64 or 256 by 256, depends on, actually that's a hyperparameter that we can choose to train the model. And the overlapping here is like the blocks sitting next to each other will have some overlapping regions so that we can mitigate the blocking artifact during the compression. And with the data ready, we now start training the model, and after a day, we will save this model for the compression stage. And during the compression, we are not using an overlapping method. We are using a destroy data partition method. Basically, small blocks there will be no overlapping regions among small blocks of data. And together with a retrain model, we put them together in a compression pipeline. And this pipeline will process all the data and will handle all the format. Then finally, we have the compressed data that we can store in our hard drive. And this compressed data is much smaller than the original data, like 100 times smaller, depends on the application. In the future, if we want to decompress the data, we will put the compressed data and use the model to decompress the whole thing, and with the metadata and all the support data, we will have the reconstructed data in a netcdf format. Now let's talk about the model architecture. Our model consists of three parts, three components: an encoder, a quantizer, and a decoder. The encoder basically reduces the dimension of the original data, and it also transforms the original data into a different domain, like a latent space. And in this latent space, we have a lot of latent variables, and these latent variables will be quantized by a quantizer. And in the quantizer, here we have the lossy compression right over there, and with this quantizer, we can use entropy coding to further compress the data down to like a fraction of the original data. And whenever we want to decode the data or decompress the data, we're going to use the decoder to decompress the data into the reconstructed data. Here we have two kinds of losses, actually two terms in the loss function. The first one is the commitment loss. If you have read the vector quantized variation of autoencoder, basically we want to match the quantized vectors in the codebooks in the two vector quantizers with the latent variables. And the second loss is the MSE, just a normal MSE loss function of the original data and the reconstructed data. And this is the result that we have. Is the data on the right, actually on the left of your sign. That's the original data from the simulated ocean surface temperature in November of the year of 0515. And on the right, that is our reconstructed data. So in terms of visualization, those two are very similar to each other. However, if you do some statistical analysis, there will be some distortion and some dissimilarities between the two, because we are using lossy compression. And here are some numbers for our results. The model architecture that I showed you earlier is actually the architecture of the third model from the top, which is the hierarchical model. As you can see here, the MSE of the model is the best one, and the compression ratio is quite good. Like the compressed data is 200 times smaller than the original data. But it is noted that I have not counted the metadata into this compression ratio calculation. With the metadata, there will be the compression ratio could reduce a lot. And we are doing compression on a test data, which is around 8 gigabytes. And the encoding time is more than a minute. And the decoding time is 1 minute and 30 seconds, 3.4, 3.5. And as I mentioned before, there are some limitations in our work, in our compression algorithms. The error in some regions are still high, so we can do some we can do visualization, we can do short-term simulation, but for long-term scientific simulation, the error will propagate in the future time steps. So we cannot right now we cannot do it. And the blocking artifact is also a problem for the reconstructed data. As you can see from this graph, this figure is the difference between the values of the original data and the reconstructed data. Right here, you can see some blocking artifact. So we are trying to do some interpolation methods to reduce this artifact. In the future, we would like to look into some adaptive weight methods because some regions are more important than other regions in terms of simulation. Furthermore, adaptive block size method would be a good choice for any compression algorithms because some regions are really hard to compress. And we also want to apply some coordinate-based networks, such as like Hieu, neural rendering, or even scientific machine learning, to impose some terms to the loss function, so we can learn all the boundaries conditions of the data. Also, we are looking into the frequency domain of the data, of the original data and the reconstructed data, because the frequency domain will give us some information of the data. And actually, there are some successful works using frequency domain to compress the signal data like speech and video compression. Thank you for listening. This concludes my research.
Time for questions.
The model is architecture with a quantizer. In that stage, consider the data as a wall or by parts or by blocks.
Data by blocks, you mean? Like,
yeah, in the quantizer stage. So
the quantizer. So after you apply the encoder to the data, you have a lot of latent variables, and those latent variables depends on what type of input to put into the model. So in this particular case, they are like 2D images, similar to that, like for example, and we will flatten them out, except the last dimension or the inner dimension, because that inner dimension will be quantized to the corresponding vectors in the code book in the 2 vector quantizers. Do some compression. This is just like one of the methods in the compression domain or information theory domain, how to compress data efficiently, effectively.
What's your motivation regarding your architecture? What's your motivation to add a 2 pair of a ResNet to that?
A ResNet? You mean?
I mean, apart from the encoder decoder, you have the res.
The pre block and the res block. Just these are some. This is very similar to the residual network. But we did some modification so that we can remove some checkable artifacts or some other artifact that if you use different type of kernels and different type of parameters, you actually can reduce some artifacts that the reconstruct data might have. So it's just like a lot of modification and a lot of type of parameter tuning and how to process the data into the correct form, because the actual application might have a noisy data, like not like a small set of data. You need to have a right format, right data to be able to train the model.